And so we've got to get out of our own way a little bit from an HR, leadership perspective. We need to get out there and understand what the nuances of our business groups are. And each business group is going to be different. And so understanding how the programs and the things that you're implementing impact each one of those areas and making sure that we're making the right tweaks to fit the needs of those specific groups within your own organization.
Welcome to the Strategic Momentum Podcast, the show where we share tips, stories, and advice from progressive leaders on what it takes to break through that business inertia and propel you and your business forward. I'm your host, Connie Steele. With the workforce constantly evolving and becoming ever more diverse, leaders are required to rethink how to best align the business dynamics with the people dynamics. Today's guest has spent her career doing just that. Bhavna Dave is the Chief People Officer at Frontpoint Security, and she's been involved in building effective HR organizations across several high-growth companies from the ground up. In this episode, Bhavna shares her perspective on the challenges that people leaders are facing today, from attracting, developing, and retaining their talent to finding those solutions needed to truly deliver business impact. Let's start at the beginning of her career journey, which she says started at home.
I was raised in a household of parents that ran their own business. So I was raised seeing a business grow from nothing to, a well-run wholesale jewelry company that was selling to Macy's and other retailers that are well-known. So I feel like a lot of my career started with the learnings from my parents, from what they struggled through, what they were dealing with, how they asked me to help when I was young and growing up, and it was kind of all hands on deck. That's when I sort of got my taste and hunger for being part of growing businesses. I will say that I set out, honestly, in a very different path. I thought I was going to be an accountant. And then in college, once I got a little exposure to what that actually meant in a workplace, I decided to figure out what other options were out there. I took an org development class and I was sold. I fell in love with the idea of helping an organization have such an impact on their business through org development, through training and development, through people within an organization. And it's been that love ever since. After undergrad, I went into the HR field, like anybody else, took a very entry-level job, and I found my first mentor. My very first mentor said, if you really want to have an impact in human resources, you need to get your MBA. You need to understand how the business operates and how the financials tie into the people strategies, and you will be truly successful, and you will carve out a niche for your impact in an organization. And I took that seriously, and that was a huge pivotal moment in my career. I decided to move from Texas, where I was born and raised in Texas, and I moved out to the East Coast. And I decided to pursue my MBA and start to build out my network from a human resource perspective and my profession out here in the East Coast. So getting my MBA was truly pivotal. I learned, ranging from, the balance sheets all the way through mergers and acquisitions. And I constantly thought about how my people strategy would play into that. And shortly after graduating, I took on a role. It was a medium-sized company that was growing. I tend to find organizations that are growing, that are building or revamping their HR or their culture, because I like to have an impact on an organization. So I quickly learned that was my sweet spot. Being able to take what I'd learned in my undergrad in human resources, my MBA, and apply that to an organization was super exciting. And I just, I worked my way up from, an individual contributor into leadership roles at varying companies. I got my experience in medium-sized organizations to large-sized organizations. And then I had another pivotal moment in my career where I was asked to take a leap forward and take a big risk on an organization to run the entire human resources group. I had experience working, in the human resources field for about 10 years at that point. But I, was in my specialized group. I had exposure to recruiting. I had exposure to the benefits and the talent operations side of things. But my sweet spot at that point was talent management. And so I said, you know what, this is my opportunity to branch out, take an organization that was about 30 employees and really step up my game, really have a big impact and put my stamp on an organization as they were growing. And so I took on that role, and that's where I was able to build from scratch an HR team as well as an organization, and really see that organization through on what they wanted to be as they grew their organization. We developed an amazing culture, an amazing organization, and amazing relationships throughout my tenure there. That's where I wanted to be. I wanted to continue to be leading an entire HR function with all the components that made up a good organization from a people perspective. And I continue my career journey doing just that.
Bhavna learned early on the importance of connecting the business dynamics to the people dynamics to build momentum and deliver true impact in any company. This, coupled with her desire to take risks, stretch herself out of her own comfort zone, as well as her entrepreneurial mindset, led her to ultimately finding her passion in building effective HR functions from the ground up. And her approach to what she does today has been shaped not only by this need to align the business, talent, and people strategy, but also this belief that there's a solution to any problem.
I look for where I can either take an HR department that is not driving the impact that the organization wants and turn them around and rebuild it from the bottom up, to building one from scratch, right? Being able to say, hey, this is what we want to achieve as a business. Can you help us build and grow the talent strategy and the people strategy behind that?
And how do you feel those experiences have shaped the way you approach what you do and how you do it today?
I learned from a very early age, you need to have a really strong work ethic. There is no problem that can't be resolved. You need to just find that in to solve that problem. There's an option, right? It may not be exactly what everybody wants, but you need to think through and think of different options to get that problem solved. So I always go into a situation saying, we can make this happen. We just got to figure out how. And I've taken that with me all throughout my career. And I think that's what's driven my success in building and growing cultures and organizations. Like I said, from, organizations that didn't have anything to organizations that needed to turn those things around. I think if you come in with a positive mindset, with a mindset around, we can get this done. We just need to figure it out how, and implementing it is what has really shaped how I approach my work and how I lead my team.
In today's business climate, change is constant, and in order for companies to keep up and succeed, having the right people powering their organizations is absolutely critical. But what challenges are modern workplaces facing when it comes to attracting, engaging, and retaining talent?
There's a generational gap, right? Right now, we've got at least 3 generations in the workplace. And the needs of each one of these generations are so different, right? And so we've got to find how to, as a people leader, as a talent leader, what are all those needs that we're looking at, and how do we provide the right solutions that will meet every generation, right? Because all of the generations are really important to us as we go and drive different solutions within the organization. So when I think of the generation that's been in the workforce the longest, I think about what their makeup is. They tend to be more loyal. They're focused on in-office hours and get focused on, when they're here, they're focused. They're focused on collaborating in person. They have one job, and their one job is their primary focus during the day. And then they go home to their family or whatever their hobby may be. Their mentality is around pay your dues. Once you prove yourself, you'll get the role, you'll get the title, you'll get the compensation. But their mindset is do first, receive rewards and things like that later. The newest generation, they they come in with a different mindset. Their focus is career growth, career progression, and fast, right? They want to be promoted within 3 months. They are willing to put in the effort and the work to get there, but they want it to happen fast. And they believe that impact can happen in a short amount of time. And all of these folks I would say in this newer generation, they've got a side hustle. It's not just about their primary job. It's about, they want to have either a side hustle being, a writer, or they have a side hustle being a fitness coach, or they're trainer at some gym. And that's just as important to them as what we would call their primary job. And so when they leave work, they go focus on this hot side hustle. Again, it could be anything. And so understanding the different dynamics of these generations is really important. I have an example. I have this guy who I was chatting with him at a company event. He was in one of the newer generations. And I said, hey, so how's your experience been here so far? What are the things that you'd like to see us change? And he said, well, I've been with the company for 2 years and I received 3 promotions during that time period. But, I really struggle with the fact that we have no career progression here at the organization. And being from a different generation, I was a little surprised by that. He'd been here for 2 years and been promoted 3 times. To me, that was career progression. So, honestly, I had to rethink how we define career progression and what does that look like? And so how do we look at what we say are the eligibility requirements, for example, to be promoted within a role? Originally it was 12 months within our organization. We've changed that. We've said, you take about 3 months to get ramped, another 3 months to be stable, and then another 3 months to kind of prove performance. And, you're eligible to be promoted within 9 months. So looking at policies, looking at practices that are more typical in an organization and challenging them. And also providing them multiple avenues, right? So, I start off talking about there's many generations in the workforce today. It's important to provide an array of options that meet both all generations, right? Some of them may overlap, some of them may not, but it's not just one path to career progression that makes sense. It's not one path to perks and benefits. It's providing them options to where they can pick and choose their path that they want to take. Providing options from a perks perspective, providing options from a career development perspective, not only learning and development opportunities, but paths to be promoted. Do they only have a path that allows them to grow in their field, or is there a way to jump into other parts of the organization? And what does that look like? And so I see that as being what has sort of the challenges that we're seeing nowadays and how things are evolving.
That's really interesting. I mean, it sounds like, you're first looking at, honestly, these personas. You're really understanding, the needs, the wants, the desires of these different generations, and fundamentally what drives them. What does success look for them? And then understanding, almost mapping out that customer journey, that employee journey. And because each of them have these different needs and wants, each of these personas, so to speak, there are different paths that you always have to consider. Otherwise, you're not going to ultimately meet, what their requirements are. But also, going back to one point that you said earlier, it's about understanding the organizational dynamics to finally determine the most optimal people impact. And really, that sounds like a lot of, what you've done, what your passion has been, and how you're trying to apply that to sort of these new generational forces that are at play.
Yeah. You had a perfect comparison. I think about the customer journey and the employee journey very similarly. I also would say that you never stop, right? It's not, let's figure out what it is, create those paths, those options, and then just stop. You've constantly got to iterate because your workforce is constantly changing. It could be because of turnover. It could be because their interests change. It could be because of different changes in the marketplace, right? And so you constantly have to be looking at that to ensure your paths are the right ones for your workforce. And so you can't just set it and forget it.
With multiple generations having differing career expectations, it's important to create solutions that align to their varying needs. Understand your employee's journey like a customer journey to rethink how career progression is defined as well as the policies and practices around it. Yet ensure that the solutions you develop are flexible and adaptable. As Bhavna says,
I think you just have to have the right mind to be able to look at how you pilot programs and test your way into things and create programs that are flexible enough that you can iterate and change so that it moves forward with your organization.
So how do you go about creating these options for your workforce?
One is you need to constantly communicate. And it's not just a one-way communication, it's a loop, right? Sharing information, sharing what you're setting up and why, and then getting the feedback on it, making sure that whatever you've implemented is having the impact that you intended. So in order to understand that, you have to first, communicate why you're doing it in the first place and the impact you expect it to have. And then number two, getting that feedback from the employees and the leaders to make sure it's having the right impact in the organization. And then the second piece of it is make it simple. We tend to sometimes overcomplicate programs and logistics of programs, and that's why it's hard to undo things. The more you take a simple approach, then you're able to iterate on it and roll it out in phases. Something my CEO said to me resonated with me, and it's visible progress. Making sure that you're not going away in a dark room and creating a program that's over complex, takes you a year and a half to implement, and then go and launch it a year and a half later. And no one hears from you in that entire year and a half, right? It's figuring out what are the right phases of that program and implementing it in small chunks. That way you're constantly iterating and it's not such a large lift. So I think, again, keeping it simple, making sure you're launching things in phases and developing things in phases and getting that constant feedback so that you're always iterating.
I love what you said because it's applying this, you start small and you test and learn along the way. You've essentially taken that product development approach of where everybody's talking about agile development and thinking and operating in an agile, flexible way and really employing that to how you roll out people programs. And I'm not going to call it HR programs because I know really it's sort of the bigger thing is about just sort of people impact. You're looking at that and how do you roll out programs that really can have a true and immediate and beneficial impact on your employee base.
Yeah, you nailed it. And similar to engineering and product development, you got to make sure code's not overly complicated so everyone can understand it, right? And so you can change it, update it, and make sure it's constantly meeting the needs of whatever you're developing, right? It works the same way with any program.
To effectively bring these new employee programs to life, remember to start small and make them simple. Constantly iterate. Don't set it and forget it. And have that continuous communication loop so that the impact you intended aligns to what you and your employees want to realize. Along with the importance of bridging generational gaps, Bhavna shares some other important considerations in terms of how to best support employees.
Honestly, two things come to mind. One, which I think is a big topic in at least the United States, maybe even globally, we're seeing just an increased amount of mental health issues in the workplace. So, in talking to my colleagues, we are seeing more of this. And I think there is an opportunity here for a lot of HR professionals to really think about how they're going to handle these, right? What are the right things to be doing? How are we going to balance the human side with the business needs? And I think that honestly is a big challenge. Got to make sure that we manage the human side of it, right? And there are a lot of elements to the human side of it already. But then we also have to make sure that we're managing anything that we need from a business perspective, whether it's thinking through, if this employee needs to go out on leave, how do we continue to keep the business operating? And the other thing is, how do we protects the organization from liabilities, because that is part of our role, which we, generally don't like to talk about, right? So how do we navigate through making sure we're doing the right thing for the employee, and we've got our human perspective on, and then also balancing what we need to do for the business. Honestly, that is one of our biggest challenges, and it's increased, I would say, over my career. And talking to other HR professionals, they're seeing that as well. And I think this is something that, I think more organizations need to talk about. I think more organizations need to think through how we can support and get the right help to these employees and continue to operate the business simultaneously. So that's one. Number two is having an open dialogue with your employees. We talk about having an open dialogue as it relates to, getting the work done, expectations of the role, success measures. But one of the biggest challenges, and I feel the biggest struggles leaders have, is really having an open dialogue on how am I going to provide this employee with the career progression or the development, not even the career progression, the development that they want, without talking about options to move out of the organization, right? Everybody's so concerned with, I got to keep this employee, that they get blinded by the idea of maybe this employee needs to spread their wings, right? And that is their only path to growth at this point. And having that open dialogue so the business can plan for it and the employees can transition and move on and grow. That is, to me, another big challenge that I constantly see in the HR, in the business world, right? And being in my role, it's one that I try to tackle head on and work with the leaders to help them understand why this is beneficial for them and why their only avenue for growth is not creating a role, but also thinking about how do I give them projects that will challenge them outside of just carving out a new role for them. How are discussions about what the rest of the marketplace looks like, other jobs that other companies look like, that may help them grow in a better way than our current organization can support. How that is so critical to your own department success and your own business success. Those conversations are the ones I like to have with leaders because they can have such an impact there, right? If they think about, the 2-week notice, for any critical employee is not enough notice to transition the work and transition it the right way. And so if we have these conversations early enough and often enough, we can plan for that. And it's not devastating to the organization, and it's not devastating to the employee. And guess what? You go support that employee in their next venture, they may come back. They may say, I've gotten this skill set from this other organization. Guess what? I can come back here and apply that with a much bigger impact to your organization, right? And so we've got to be less short-sighted about these things and have these open dialogues.
So do you feel some of those challenges are as a result of, this growing sort of talent shortage or perceived talent shortage? So there's a desire to want to focus on, just pure retention versus almost the employee life cycle, let's put it, that you're looking at the role growth of this individual, which could ultimately lead to broader business growth, just not in a very linear fashion.
I think that's part of it, yes. I also think that there is a reflection or maybe a negative stigma, I should say, to turnover. And no leader wants that, right? They don't want to say, you know what, I turned over my entire team this year because they were looking for career growth, right? So I think that stigma plays against leaders doing the right thing. And so I think we need to think about, as leaders in the organization and as talent leaders in the organization, thinking about all the different paths that an employee can take and make sure it's not so linear, like you mentioned, right? There are challenging projects. There are ways to carve out different paths for different employees. And if you can't do that, then what is their path to move to another organization that can? And I think if more organizations focused on that and focused on developing their employees to build and grow their skills, there'll be less of a concern around retention and the talent pool because there'll be more skilled, more highly desirable talent pool. It will get larger. I think there's this preconceived notion of, there is only a handful of people that can be high performing. You think about your performance, bell curves and things like that. So if you think about if only 10% of your population can be, air quotes, high performing, you think about the talent pool at large that same way, right? And I personally think I personally don't think that's the way to think about it. If we focus on improving skills, upskilling our base, and if they leave, you're throwing better workers out there into the talent pool. And if all employers do that, your talent pool will be perceived as more talented, and more of that concept of, people in that high performing bucket will grow, versus this mindset that, business leaders and HR tend to have of, only about 10% are considered high performing.
Having a more expansive view of how you support and develop your employees from a true lifecycle perspective versus a more narrow retention and performance perspective benefits everyone, because in the end, you are growing the overall talent pool in the long run. So think about taking a long-term approach, even if that means letting your employees continue their careers elsewhere. So what else can HR professionals do to best support their workforce?
I think, as talent evolves, the perception has evolved, which is great, but I don't think all employees are there yet, right? And so I think having conversations with the organization and with your employees, with the leaders, and educating them on what our role really should be and really is, people will change their perception of HR, right? So my role here is not to understand our policies inside and out. My role is to help guide our employees and our leaders to make the right decisions, and to communicate and remove obstacles. There's a huge opportunity for HR professionals that are doing things that are at that more strategic level, are outside of the old school HR mentality. They have an opportunity to educate other HR professionals and educate employees within their organization so that we can get rid of this mindset of what the old HR used to be like. Every time I go to a new organization, I start to work with employees or leaders, they always tell me I'm very different than their other HR leaders and that I do things very differently. And I always ask why. Like, why do you say that? Well, what was your old HR like that, and what was your communication with them around? And they said they weren't out and about in the business. They didn't understand what the business was doing, the goals, how to get there. They didn't understand the nuances of their team and how they work. And number two, they weren't this neutral party that they could be a sounding board to help them come to the right solutions. And so we've got to get out of our own way a little bit from an HR, leadership perspective. We need to get out there and understand what the nuances of our business groups are. And each business group is going to be different. And so understanding how the programs and the things that you're implementing impact each one of those areas and making sure that we're making the right tweaks to fit the needs of those specific groups within your own organization.
What do you think inhibits some of the HR leaders from looking at things from a more holistic business point of view, which, is critical to developing the right programs, creating the right communications, and building the sort of trusted relationships between, employees and the HR function and leadership?
I think it's just years of HR being done that way, right? So this is all they know. This is all they've seen. And so I think a lot of HR leaders are coming along, right? But I think we need to have more discussion around this. They need to find other leaders to network with, to get ideas, to learn from. And, honestly, I've been to a lot of HR networking programs and networking conferences, and that needs to evolve, right? We need to be talking about different things. We need to bring in the business leaders, not just continue to focus on employment law and things that we already know, right? But we need to start talking about some of the other topics and the challenges that we're seeing in the workplace.
Do you think sort of the rapid change of business today is also forcing that discussion because of the fact that, there is constant changes in new products, new services, which then has a domino effect on really every facet, that's caused really a need to rethink the way that, hiring, retaining, so skill development is fundamentally thought of?
I definitely think that's part of it. I also think that CEOs and executives are demanding more, right? They want something very different from their HR leader, but sometimes they don't know what that is. And I will tell you, when I left my last company and was going through that, my last company was sold. And, as I was going through the interview process, I met a ton of CEOs, a ton of executives. And the common theme was, I don't really know what I want. I need someone to tell me what I'm missing. And I haven't been able to have a leader that can provide that for me. So that's where the conversations really took off. When I was able to say, here's what you need and here's why you need it. And that resonated with them. So, I think there's a lot more executives that know that the old school HR is not the approach that they want to take, but they're not really sure exactly what the new HR looks like or the impact that they can have, but they know they want that, right? They know that they need that to scale their business. So I think a lot of it comes from the demand of the executive team.
And what it sounds like, it's really about integrating those ongoing business dynamics that are changing and influencing the way, leaders have to think these days, but melding that with the ongoing changes of the people dynamics that are occurring, which then causes someone to really think through the organizational dynamics and really mapping that out in a fundamentally different way.
Absolutely. It has to go hand in hand. And neither one is static the business dynamics, the people dynamics, it's very complicated to navigate, right? So you've got to constantly be right alongside with the business and understanding the dynamics, where you're headed, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now, so that your people strategy and your people plans align right there with it.
By being that strategic partner to business stakeholders and truly understanding the impacts employee programs are having or not having, HR leaders can better integrate the needs of the business and the people who are driving it. Because effective HR organizations are no longer one-dimensional. In fact,
there's multiple components to it, right? Operational, the people side of it, it's the business impact side of it, it's the communication aspects of it. A huge part of our roles are to help and drive communication, because a lot of the problems can be resolved with the right level of communication.
So to close, what's the best work advice Bhavna has ever received?
So I've taken probably about 3 little nuggets away from various people I've had in my career. And the first one is to provide the why. Always, the more you can share with an individual, whether it's an employee on your own team, whether it's a business leader that you're coaching, is provide them the why and ask a ton of questions to get to the root cause. Because whatever, the problem is, you've got to go layers deep. And if you don't ask the questions, you'll never get to the root cause. So those 2 things I believe go hand in hand. The second piece of advice, I got early in my career from someone who has a lot of, is super courageous, I would say, in how she approaches things. Well, she said, speak up, no matter what, no matter whether you're going with in a group discussion, you're going with the grain of salt or you're going against it, right? Because it's important for every perspective to be heard. And it's really important for you to speak up, ask your questions, no matter what level you're at, right? So I did that in my early days, meeting with some of the executives where I was an individual contributor, an entry-level person. I spoke up. I asked questions. I honestly think that helped build my credibility because I was never scared to share my opinion, even if it wasn't the opinion of the others in the room. And I just, again, shared the why behind it. So I challenged the way things were always done or challenged the status quo. And I spoke up. And again, it was no matter what level I was at. And the third thing, which kind of ties into the speak up, is operate at that higher level too. Don't let your job description define what your impact can be. It's okay to swim outside your lane sometimes if you think that's the right thing to do for the organization, and make sure you're bringing people along with you. Don't let the job description define your impact. So I think those are three things that I have taken with me in each of my roles, in how I coach others, how I lead my team. And it's been really impactful for me.
And finally, what's the best way listeners can connect with you?
LinkedIn. That's the easiest way. I'm on LinkedIn. And if people want to come out and see some different things that I'm interested in, they can participate in a group that I support, which is called Disrupt HRDC. We're having our next event in October. If you're interested in understanding what that's all about, check it out, Disrupt HRDC.
Thanks so much for your time today, Bhavna. Really great perspective on how to think about giving options and really creating that true business impact from a people strategy perspective.
Thank you.
When it comes to really moving businesses forward, remember that it's the people behind the company that fuel its momentum. Develop people strategies and flexible programs that adapt to the changing needs and motivators for your employees, as well as the business. Shift from a linear and tactical approach to a more iterative and strategic one. Because when you balance the human side with the business needs, you'll then be able to effectively impact your organization. Thanks for listening to the Strategic Momentum Podcast. You can connect with Bhavna on LinkedIn at Bhavna Dave, that's BHAVNADAVE, and find out more about Disrupt HR at disrupthr.com/city/Washington. If you've liked what you heard, please subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And while you're there, please leave us a review. To hear previous episodes or get show notes from this episode, you can visit us at flywheelassociates.com/podcast. And don't forget to follow Strategic Momentum on Facebook and Instagram. I'm Connie Steele, and you've been listening to the Strategic Momentum Podcast.